The signal was 16 seconds long. That was the first thing the Vel listening post recorded, and the first thing they almost dismissed. 16 seconds of a frequency no civilized species used anymore, broadcast on an old gravitational carrier wave that had been deprecated 400 cycles before any of the current operators were born. The duty officer, a thin-limbed Vel named Karen, leaned toward the console with the kind of curiosity reserved for harmless anomalies. Probably a derelict beacon. Probably a dying probe from some forgotten colonial venture. Probably nothing. He told his subordinate to log it and move on. His subordinate did not move on. She was a younger officer, only 3 molts past her certification, and she had the unfortunate habit of listening to things twice. She replayed the signal. Then she replayed it again. Then she did something the manual specifically discouraged. She ran it through a translation matrix older than the station itself, a deep archive linguistic lattice that contained every recorded language fragment the Concorde had ever catalogued, including the dead ones, the lost ones, and the ones that had been quarantined for reasons no one currently alive remembered. The matrix took longer than it should have. It hummed. It paused. It produced a single line of text and then, oddly, refused to produce any more. The line read, *, we are still here. Please come, *. OSS Karen read it twice. Then he read it a third time, slowly, because something about the phrasing was wrong in a way he couldn't immediately name. It was not the grammar. The grammar was clean. It was not the request, which was simple enough. It was the word still. That word implied a previous expectation. It implied that whoever was sending the message believed someone had been waiting for them. It implied a relationship. The Vel had no relationships in that sector. No one did. That sector was empty. He checked the origin coordinates and felt the small, cold tightening behind his eyes that his species used in place of a frown. The signal was coming from a region of space that did not appear on civilian charts, a quiet pocket between 2 old trade lanes, designated only by a numerical reference and a single annotation in the Concorde's deep records. * restricted. Do not approach. See Archive 7, *. Archive 7 was not a place anyone visited casually. It was a sealed memory vault maintained by the Concorde's oldest member species, the Theln, who guarded it the way a careful parent guards a cabinet of old knives. When OSS Karen filed his query, he expected a polite delay, a routine approval, perhaps a request for clarification. Instead, within 4 minutes, his console locked. His credentials were suspended. His superior's superior was on the line. The voice on the other end was Theln. It was old and it was tired, and it asked him only one question. How long was the signal? 16 seconds, honored elder. There was a pause. A long one. Long enough that OSS Karen began to wonder if the connection had failed. Then the Theln said, very softly, 16 seconds is too long. The line closed. Within the hour, 3 Concorde cruisers were redirected from their patrol routes and ordered toward the empty sector. Within 6 hours, a full investigation fleet was being assembled at the nearest staging system. Within a day, the matter had reached the High Convocation itself, and somewhere in the deepest chamber of the Theln archive, a door that had been sealed for 900 cycles was being opened by trembling hands. And in the empty sector, on a small gray world that no chart acknowledged, a woman named Mara Salvin was kneeling in the dust beside a transmitter she had built from the corpse of a starship, whispering the same 16 seconds into the void over and over again, because she did not yet know that anyone had heard her. She had been whispering for 11 years. The colony had not been a colony. That was the first thing the Concorde investigators would eventually have to understand, and the thing they would resist understanding the longest. It had been a research expedition, a small one, 42 human scientists and engineers sent to study a stellar anomaly in a region their own government had marked as low priority. They were not soldiers. They were not pioneers. They were specialists in narrow fields, the kind of people who wrote papers no one read and argued about decimal places at conferences. Their ship was modest. Their supplies were calculated for a 2-year mission with a generous safety margin. They had been stranded for 13 years. The stellar anomaly they had come to study was not an anomaly. It was a scar. It was the residue of something the Concorde had done a very long time ago, something Archive 7 existed specifically to forget, and when the human ship crossed the threshold of that residue, every piece of long-range communication equipment they carried went silent in the same instant. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Silenced. As if the space around them had been wrapped in a hand and squeezed. They did not panic at first. They were scientists. They ran diagnostics. They tried alternate channels. They sent a probe back along their entry vector and watched it vanish without ever reporting a single byte. By the end of the third week, the expedition leader, a quiet man named Dr. Yusuf Arenal, gathered everyone in the Central Bay and told them, in the calmest voice he could manage, that they were going to have to assume no one was coming. He was correct. No one was coming. The Concorde did not know they were there. The humans' own government, when the expedition failed to report, eventually filed the loss as an unrecoverable accident and moved on. There were no rescue missions. There were no follow-up expeditions. The 42 scientists became a line in a budget report and then, eventually, not even that. What the Concorde would later struggle to understand was what happened next. The humans did not die. They should have. By every model the Concorde's xenosociologists had ever built, by every projection their behavioral economists had ever run, the expedition should have collapsed within a year. Their food supplies were finite. Their shelter was a research vessel never meant for permanent habitation. The gray world below them was barely habitable, with a thin, bitter atmosphere and a sun that gave more light than warmth. There were no native species to learn from. There were no resources easy to extract. There was nothing. And yet, when the Concorde fleet finally arrived in the empty sector, 11 years after the signal first began and 13 years after the expedition was lost, they found something on the gray world that none of their models had predicted. They found a town. It was not large. It was not beautiful. It was a low cluster of structures built from the salvaged bones of the research vessel, reinforced with stone cut by hand and mortared with something the investigators would later identify as a mixture of human blood, mineral paste, and a fungal binder cultivated from the world's only viable life form, a pale lichen that grew in the shadow of rocks. The structures were arranged in a careful pattern, with channels for water and vents for heat and small enclosed gardens where things grew under sheets of salvaged plastic. There was a central square. There was a meeting hall. There was a graveyard. The graveyard had 29 markers. The Concorde investigators, who landed in full environmental suits with weapons drawn because their protocols demanded it, were met at the edge of the town by 13 humans. They were thin. They were weathered. Their clothing was a patchwork of original expedition fabric and woven lichen fiber. Their eyes were the eyes of people who had not expected to see anyone again, and who were now uncertain whether seeing someone was good news or bad. At the front of the group stood a woman in her late 40s, with gray threading through her dark hair and a long scar running from her temple to her jaw. She was holding a child. The child was perhaps 4 years old, small and quiet, with the alert stillness of something that had learned early not to make noise. The woman did not lower the child when the investigators approached. She did not step back. She simply waited, and when the lead investigator finally found the words to ask who she was, she answered in a voice that was hoarse from disuse but perfectly steady. "My name is Mara Salvin. I sent the signal. Are you here to help us, or are you here to decide what to do about us?" The lead investigator did not know how to answer. He had not been briefed for that question. He had been briefed for a rescue. He had been briefed for survivors who would weep with relief. He had not been briefed for a woman who, after 11 years of whispering into the void, looked at her rescuers and asked them, first, whether they had come with mercy or with judgment. He told her, truthfully, that he did not know. She nodded as if that was the answer she had expected, and she turned, and she led them into the town. What the investigators learned over the following days became the first piece of a report that would eventually be classified at the highest level the Concorde possessed. The report was never released publicly. Fragments of it would leak over the decades, and those fragments would form the basis of a quiet, persistent unease that would settle over the older species of the galaxy whenever the subject of humanity came up. But the full report, with all its careful documentation and all its careful omissions, was sealed inside Archive 7, beside the older records it had been written to accompany. The records it accompanied described what the Concord had done to the previous inhabitants of that sector 900 cycles before. There had been a species there once. A small one, technologically modest, occupying a handful of worlds along the edge of what was then frontier space. They had been quiet. They had been peaceful. They had also, by an accident of their biology, been carriers of a microbial agent that the Concord's then dominant species could not tolerate. The agent was not lethal. It was merely uncomfortable, producing a chronic low-grade illness in any non-native who spent extended time near a carrier. The Concord, in its wisdom, had debated the matter for some time and had eventually concluded that the most efficient solution was containment. The carrier species was relocated, gently, to a single world. Their other settlements were dismantled. Their trade routes were closed. Their sector was sealed. The relocation had not gone as planned. The carrier species, deprived of their distributed habitat, had declined. Within 4 generations, they were extinct. The Concord had recorded this outcome as a regrettable miscalculation and had sealed the sector to prevent the microbial agent from spreading to other populations. The gray world where the human expedition had landed was the last of the relocation sites. The lichen growing in the shadows of the rocks was the final remnant of the carrier species' agricultural cultivars. The fungal binder the humans had used to build their town was a domesticated organism 900 cycles old, grown from spores that had survived in dormancy beneath the soil. The humans had not known any of this. What they had known was that the world was hostile and that they were alone and that something in the air was making them sick. The chronic low-grade illness that had so troubled the old Concord species affected humans too, though differently. It did not produce the same discomfort. It produced something the Concord's medical xenologists would later describe, in carefully neutral language, as accelerated cellular stress with cumulative organ degradation. In plain terms, it was killing them. Slowly. One organ at a time. Over years. 29 of the original 42 had already died by the time the rescue arrived. The graveyard markers recorded the dates. The earliest was 8 months after landing. The most recent was 4 months before the signal was first sent. The 13 who remained were all sick. All of them. Without exception. The medical scans the investigators ran, once they understood what they were looking at, showed a population whose internal tissues were in various stages of slow failure. Most of them had perhaps 2 to 5 years left. Mara Salvin, who was 47, had perhaps 18 months. The child she was holding, who had been born on the gray world and had never breathed any other air, had perhaps 6. The child's name was Ilsa. She was the youngest of 4 children who had been born in the colony. The other 3 were buried in the graveyard. It was at this point in the investigation that the lead investigator, a careful Vel named Tanvelis who had been chosen for the mission specifically because of his reputation for emotional restraint, asked Mara Salvin the question that would, eventually, become the question the entire galaxy would have to answer. He asked her why she had kept sending the signal. She was sitting across from him in what the humans called the meeting hall, a low stone room with a long table and a single lamp powered by a salvaged battery cell. She was holding a cup of something warm, made from the lichen, that smelled faintly of rust and ash. She looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "Because someone had to know we were here," she said. He told her, gently, that he understood. He told her that the urge to be remembered was a universal one, common to all sapient species, and that he respected the courage it had taken to broadcast for so long without any indication that anyone was listening. She shook her head. She set down the cup. "You don't understand," she said. "I wasn't sending the signal so that someone would remember us. I was sending it so that someone would not make the same mistake." He did not, at first, understand what she meant. She explained. She explained that within the first year of their stranding, once the deaths had begun, Dr. Arenal had identified the microbial agent. He had not known its history. He had not known whose world they were on. But he had been a careful man and a thorough one, and he had documented the agent's properties, its transmission vectors, its long-term effects, and the precise progression of its damage through human tissue. He had written it all down. He had built a complete medical record. And then, before he died in the 3rd year, he had given that record to Mara Solvin and had asked her to do one thing. He had asked her to make sure that whoever came next would know. Whoever came next. Not whoever rescued them. Not whoever found them. Whoever came next. Because Dr. Arenal had understood, in a way that the Concord investigators were only beginning to understand, that the Grey World was a trap. It had killed 42 scientists who had not known it was a trap. And if the signal was not sent, and if the record was not delivered, then sooner or later, somewhere, another expedition would arrive in another sealed sector with another forgotten history, and 42 more people would die. The humans had not been sending an SOS. They had been sending a warning. For 11 years. Tanvelis sat very still in the low stone room and did not, for a long time, say anything. He was thinking about the 16 seconds. He was thinking about the phrase "please come," and how he had assumed it meant "please rescue us," when in fact it had meant "please come and learn what we have learned, before someone else has to learn it the way we did." He was thinking about the fact that the humans had known, for 11 years, that they were dying. That every transmission they sent, every day they survived, every child they brought into the cold, thin air of the Grey World, was a deliberate continuation of a task they had assigned themselves. Not survival. Not rescue. Documentation. Warning. The slow, patient construction of a message that would outlive them. He was thinking about the graveyard. He asked her, very carefully, why they had continued to have children. Knowing what they knew. Knowing what the air was doing to them. Mara Solvin looked at him for a long time. The scar on her face caught the lamplight. Because the signal needed someone to keep sending it, she said. After we were gone. He did not understand. He said so. She explained, patiently, as if to a child. The transmitter required maintenance. The power systems required maintenance. The antenna required cleaning and recalibration and occasional repair. None of these tasks could be automated because they did not have the components to automate them. The signal would only continue for as long as someone was there to continue it. And so, when it became clear in the 3rd year that none of them would live long enough to be certain the signal had been received, they had made a decision. Together, as a group, they had decided to raise a generation. Not many. They did not have the resources for many, but enough. Enough that when the original 42 were gone, there would be someone left who knew how to maintain the transmitter, and who understood why it mattered, and who would continue sending the 16 seconds for as long as their own bodies allowed. And then, if necessary, that generation would raise the next one. And the next. For as long as it took. They had been prepared, Mara Solvin said, to send the signal for 1,000 years. Tanvelis looked at the child in her lap. The quiet 4-year-old with the alert stillness. Ilsa, who had perhaps 6 years left. He understood, then, what the child was. He understood what every child in the graveyard had been. He understood what the humans had done, deliberately and patiently and with full knowledge of the cost, for the sake of a message that they themselves would never know had been received. He stood up. He left the meeting hall. He went outside into the cold, thin air of the Grey World, and he walked to the edge of the town, and he stood there for a long time looking at the small gray horizon and the small gray sun. When he returned to his ship, he did something that no Vel officer of his rank had done in 400 cycles. He overrode his standing orders. He sent a priority transmission directly to the High Convocation, bypassing his immediate superiors, and he requested an emergency session. The transmission included a single attached file. It was a copy of Dr. Arenal's medical record. The complete one. The one Mara Solvin had handed him, without ceremony, the morning after his first night in the town, the way a person hands over something that has finally finished being heavy. The convocation met in closed session. The contents of that session have never been disclosed. What is known is that within a week of the meeting, 3 things happened. The first was that every sealed sector in Concord space, every region marked * restricted. Do not approach. See Archive 7, * was placed under active monitoring. Not to prevent entry. To detect entrance. Because the convocation had finally been forced to confront a question it had avoided for 900 cycles, which was the question of how many other expeditions, from how many other species, might have wandered into how many other sealed traps over the centuries, and might still be there, dying slowly, sending signals no one was listening for. The second was that Archive 7 was opened. Fully. For the first time since its founding. The Theln who guarded it did not resist. They had been waiting, some of the older ones would later say, for someone to finally ask. The third was that a quiet, careful, exhaustively documented effort began to identify and contact every species whose homeworld had ever been catalogued by the Concord but never formally acknowledged. The effort was given a name in the internal records. It was called the Solven Protocol. None of this, of course, helped the 13 humans on the Grey World. The Concord's medical xenologists worked with extraordinary speed once the scope of the situation was understood. They identified treatments. They synthesized counteragents. They flew in equipment that, by the standards of the Grey World, was miraculous. They were able to halt the progression of the cellular damage in 11 of the 13 survivors. They were able to repair some of it. They were not able to repair Mara Solven. Her organ degeneration had passed a threshold beyond which the available treatments could only slow the decline, not reverse it. The medical team estimated her remaining life expectancy at 3 to 5 years, with significant quality of life impairment. They were apologetic. They offered her every comfort the Concord could provide. They offered to transport her to any world she chose, to give her whatever she wanted, for whatever time she had left. She asked them to leave the transmitter running. They did not understand. They explained that the signal was no longer necessary. The warning had been received. The Solven protocol was already underway. The other sealed sectors were being checked. Whatever message she had wanted to send had been sent, had been heard, had been acted upon. There was no further purpose to the broadcast. She listened to them patiently. Then she said, "There might be others." They asked her what she meant. "There might be others," she said again. "Other species. In other sectors. Sending their own signals. On frequencies you stopped listening to a long time ago. I want the transmitter to keep running. I want it to listen as well as send. I want it to hear them if they're out there." The medical team exchanged glances. They were not authorized to make that decision. They sent the request up the chain. The chain, this time, did not hesitate. The transmitter stayed. In the months that followed, as the surviving humans were gradually integrated into the wider Concord, as Ilsa and the other colony-born children were given medical care and education and the first taste of an atmosphere that did not slowly kill them, the transmitter on the Grey World continued to operate. It continued to send the 16 seconds. It also began to listen, on every old frequency the Concord had abandoned, in every protocol the archives still remembered. In the 4th month, it heard something. It was faint. It was old. It was in a language the Matrix could not immediately identify. It came from a sector 3 jumps away, another sealed region, another piece of the Concord's quietly buried history. When the translators finally cracked it, they found a single phrase, repeating the way Mara Solvens had repeated. The phrase, in its closest human rendering, was, "We are waiting. We have been waiting, A fleet was dispatched within hours. By the end of the 1st year, for such signals had been found. By the end of the 2nd, 11. Each one came from a sector the Concord had sealed and forgotten. Each one came from survivors or descendants of survivors of an event the older species had decided was better unrecorded. The Concord, which had governed the galaxy for longer than any other institution and had believed itself to be the keeper of the galaxy's conscience, was forced to confront the slow accumulating weight of its own quiet erasures. The galaxy began to change. It changed slowly, in the way large institutions change, with arguments and reviews and committees and reluctant admissions. But it changed. The Solven protocol expanded. Reparations were attempted, where reparations were possible. Apologies were offered, where apologies could still be heard. A new kind of listening became, very gradually, a part of how the Concord did its work. And through all of it, the transmitter on the Grey World kept running. Mara Solven lived for 3 years and 4 months after the rescue. She spent most of that time on the Grey World, by her own choice, in the small stone house she had built. She was given the best palliative care the Concorde could provide. She was visited often by investigators and historians and, eventually, by representatives of the species the Solven Protocol had reached. Some of those representatives came from worlds where her name was already, in the early stages, becoming a word that meant something more than a name. Ilsa stayed with her until the end. She had been given the option to leave, to be raised on a healthier world, to live a longer life than the gray world could offer. The Concorde's medical teams had been able to give her more time than they had been able to give her mother, but not as much as a child should have. Perhaps 20 years. Perhaps 25. She chose to stay. When asked why, by a gentle Feln historian who had come to record the colony's history before the last of its memory was lost, Ilsa answered with the directness of a child who had grown up in a place where words had to be spent carefully. Because someone has to keep listening, she said. After my mother is gone. The Feln historian, who was very old and had seen many things, wept. The Feln do not weep often. When they do, it is recorded. Mara Solven died on a cold morning in the 4th year after the rescue, in the small stone house, with her daughter beside her and the transmitter humming quietly in the next room. Her last words, according to the record, were not dramatic. She did not deliver a speech. She did not pass on a final piece of wisdom. She simply looked at Ilsa, and she smiled, and she said, "Keep it running." Ilsa kept it running. She kept it running for 19 more years, until her own body, damaged from birth by the gray world's slow poison, could no longer sustain the work. By then, she had trained others. The Concorde had stationed a small permanent team on the gray world, by request, to assist with the transmitter's operation. The team rotated every 2 years. Volunteers were never in short supply. The position was considered, in certain quiet circles of the older species, to be one of the highest honors the Concorde could bestow. The transmitter continues to operate today. It has operated continuously for over a century. It sends the 16 seconds, in the original human encoding, on the original deprecated frequency. It also listens, on every old channel the archives still remember, for any voice that might be calling from any sector the galaxy has forgotten. It has heard 43 such voices over the years. 43 sealed sectors. 43 buried histories. 43 small populations, some only a handful of survivors, some entire civilizations rebuilt in the dark, all of them sending signals into a silence they did not know was finally, at last, listening back. The galaxy will be unsealing its own history for a long time yet. There is no estimate for when the work will be done. Some of the older Thelns say it may never be done, because every era of every species produces new silences, and the work of breaking them is the work of every generation that follows. They say this with a kind of weary acceptance that they did not have before the gray world. The Concorde's behavioral xenologists, in the decades after the rescue, produced many papers on what came to be called the Solven phenomenon. They tried to understand it. They tried to model it. They tried to explain how a small group of frightened, dying scientists, with no military training and no strategic resources and no realistic hope of rescue, had reorganized themselves so completely around the construction of a message that they had been willing to raise children for the sole purpose of continuing it. They tried to explain how those children had accepted that purpose. They tried to explain how Mara Solven had walked toward her rescuers, holding her dying daughter, and had asked them not whether they had come to save her, but whether they had come to listen. The papers reached many conclusions. Most of them were carefully worded. Most of them used phrases like adaptive altruism and intergenerational mission orientation and anomalous persistence under terminal conditions. The phrases were accurate, in the way that the word ocean is accurate when applied to a thing one has never swum in. The most honest paper, the one still cited most often, was written by a Vel who had been present at the rescue. He had risen, by then, to a senior position in the Concorde's Xenosociology division. His name was Tanvelis. His paper was short. It contained no models. It contained no statistical analyses. It contained, at its center, a single observation, which the author noted he had been unable to incorporate into any existing framework and which he was therefore presenting in plain language for the consideration of his colleagues. The observation was this. Every species the Concord had ever encountered, when faced with extinction, had done one of two things. They had fought or they had grieved. Some had fought magnificently. Some had grieved with great dignity. Both responses were understood. Both responses were modeled. Both responses fit within the frameworks the Concord xenologists had spent millennia developing. The humans on the gray world had done neither. They had not fought because there was nothing to fight. They had not grieved because grief presumed an audience, and they had believed themselves to be alone. Instead, they had done a third thing, a thing the frameworks did not contain and could not contain, because no other species had ever done it under those conditions. They had decided that their deaths were unacceptable as the end of the story, and so they had continued the story past their deaths. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Literally. They had built a transmitter, and they had raised children, and they had whispered into the void for 11 years and would have whispered for 1,000 more if the void had not finally whispered back, because the alternative, to them, was a silence in which someone else would one day die the same way, and that silence was, to them, more terrible than any individual death their own bodies could suffer. Tanvelis wrote in the final paragraph of his paper that he did not know what to call this quality. He wrote that it was not courage, because courage implied a moment of choice, and the humans had not chosen once. They had chosen every day for 13 years, in the cold, thin air of a world that was killing them, with no audience and no reward and no certainty that the choice mattered. He wrote that it was not hope, because hope implied an expectation, and the humans had expected nothing. He wrote that it was not love, although love was part of it, and it was not duty, although duty was part of it, and it was not faith, although faith was part of it. He wrote that it was something the human language had a word for, which the Concord's languages did not, and that the word was witness. He wrote that the humans had refused, with a refusal so total that it had reorganized their biology and their family structures and their entire understanding of what a life was for, to allow their suffering to go unwitnessed. Not because they wanted credit. Not because they wanted memorials. Because they understood, in some way the older species had forgotten or had never known, that an unwitnessed suffering was a suffering that would happen again. He wrote that he did not know whether this quality was admirable or terrifying. He wrote that he suspected it was both. He wrote that the galaxy had spent 900 cycles building careful silences around its mistakes, and that the humans, in 11 years, had broken those silences with nothing but a transmitter built from a dead ship and a discipline so quiet that no one had noticed it until it was too late to look away. He ended the paper with a single sentence, which has been quoted in every major xenosociological work published in the Concord since. He wrote, "They are not the strongest species we have encountered. They are the species that does not stop, The transmitter on the gray world is still running. It sends the 16 seconds in Mara Solvin's original encoding on Mara Solvin's original frequency. It listens on every channel the Concord has ever used, and on many it has long since abandoned. It is maintained by a rotating team of volunteers from 41 different species, who come to the gray world for 2 years at a time and who speak, when they return, with the quiet of people who have stood for a while inside a thing larger than themselves. The graveyard has been preserved. The markers have not been replaced. The stones the humans cut by hand, mortared with their own blood and the lichen of a species they did not know they were honoring, still stand. The town is a museum now, in a sense, although the people who tend it do not use that word. They use a word from the old human languages, a word Mara Solvin used in her last recorded interview, when she was asked what she hoped would be remembered of the place. She said she hoped it would be remembered as a vigil. That is what they call it now. The vigil. The vigil on the gray world. The vigil that does not end. And somewhere in the deep archives of the Concord, in a sealed file that requires the highest clearance to access, there is a recording of the original 16 seconds. The audio is poor. The encoding is old. The voice is a woman's, hoarse from disuse, speaking into a transmitter she had built from the corpse of a starship on a world that was killing her 11 years before anyone heard her. We are still here. Please come, The older species of the galaxy, when they hear that recording, sit very quietly for a long time afterward. They do not speak. They do not move. They sit, and they listen, and they think about all the silences they once thought were peaceful, and all the voices they once thought were not worth recording, and all the sectors they once thought were safely sealed. And in the small cold pause between the end of the recording and the moment they remember how to breathe again, every one of them understands, in the part of themselves that does not yet have a word for it, that the galaxy is no longer a place where suffering goes unwitnessed. Because somewhere, on a gray world that no chart used to acknowledge, a transmitter is still running. And it is listening.